Okay, this is talk 4 in the series on how to stop being simple or naive and become wise. So another point. Wise people do not follow any crowd or crave for the approval of others. They aim to do what's right, even if it makes them the odd one out and brings disapproval, unpopularity, and so forth. Now, the Bible frequently refers to people as sheep. And it does so for a very good reason, because it's a very, very common trait amongst human beings to follow the crowd and to do whatever people around us are doing, regardless of whether it's right or wrong. It's like almost overwhelming craving to just be liked, to be popular, to fit in, to do what others are doing, to dress like them, look like them, be like them, sound like them, and be accepted by them. But God specifically warns the Israelites not to follow the practices and ways of the people of Egypt. He tells them also not to follow the ways of the Canaanites. Now, it's not just the Egyptians and Canaanites that we need to avoid following. It's the English people. We need to not be like them. We need to not be like American people. We need to not be like French people. We need to not be like German people. We need to not be like any country that's doing the wrong thing. We need to not follow the habits, the cultures, the values, the standards of those people. But there is a very strong craving to fit in, to be accepted, to be popular. It's immensely deep. And it makes people into followers and conformists and compromisers. But the point is that doing what is right will bring you into conflict with the world. It's not just a possibility, it's inevitable. And it's more so now than it has been for a long time. In this country, at least. We're beginning to get what some of the rest of the world have had and always had, which is persecution for being Christian. We're beginning to get it at a low level, and we don't like it even at a low level, do we? But we must never follow or imitate a crowd. Make your mind up now what you're going to do, how you're going to be. Resolve now that you don't seek popularity, you're not after approval, you don't require endorsement, you don't need to fit in. Indeed, you can't fit in. It's a choice you have to make. You either fit in or you please God. You can't please God and fit in. So it says in Exodus 23:2, do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. Don't follow crowds. If ever you're following a crowd, you'll be almost certainly going the wrong direction. Because the narrow path is called a narrow path for a reason, because it's narrow and there's not many on it. But it's not only ordinary people who follow crowds. Even those people who are meant to be leaders and teachers do it. And a weak or cowardly leader or church leader or manager or boss will allow himself to be intimidated and pressured by those under him. I've seen that so many times. Leaders in the world of work and in churches who will let themselves be intimidated, pressurized, and squeezed into a mold. And you absolutely mustn't do it. You have to make a decision that you're not going to. But you have to do it beforehand. It's very difficult to make that decision in the heat of the moment. If you haven't made that decision beforehand, when the heat of the moment comes, you'll probably buckle and fit in. It's got to be something you've resolved and settled in your mind beforehand. Look at what Pontius Pilate did. He was a leader. And he knew what the right thing to do was. He knew he should have released Jesus Christ. Why didn't he? Because he was afraid of the Jewish leaders. But what was he actually afraid of? The Jewish leaders had no way of putting him in personal danger. We cannot say that Pilate was in fear of his life, because he wasn't. Or what was he in fear of? In fear of disapproval and criticism. Well, this is a Roman governor of a province. What's he doing being afraid of criticism? He's answerable to Caesar, isn't he? But he was afraid of a crowd. Not physical danger. They weren't powerful enough to storm the place and take Pilate. He was just afraid of their disapproval. And for the sake of their avoiding their disapproval, he made himself almost a byword, didn't he, for incurring God's disapproval. I think he regrets it now. But you're in exactly the same situation. You have to make a choice. You can either have God's approval or you can have approval of the people around you. You can't have both. You might have been able to have both in 1875, but you can't have it now. Even then, you could only have had it in certain places in the world, not everywhere. Today, you can't have it. So, there's nothing unusual or rare about what Pilate did. There are countless politicians, managers, officials, headmasters, church leaders, and so on, doing it all the time. Failing in their duty, not doing what their duty says, choosing the line of least resistance. Avoiding flack, choosing what's wrong but popular instead of what's right but unpopular. Now, a wise person, it's not that they don't have a wish to be approved of. I'd like to be approved of. I'd like everyone to line up outside after this and say what a marvellous person I am. How you all regard me as a model for a Christian. That would be nice. But I don't require it. I don't really expect it either. I don't require it. And I'd be very foolish to require it. But there is a desire in all of us for approval. But you have to harness it. You have to say, no, I recognize that desire for approval. I'm not going to indulge it. I'm going to say no to it. I'm not going to be led by it. So a wise person recognizes his own fear of public opinion. I say things on Twitter. I don't like people writing back telling me what an idiot I am. I'd rather they wrote back saying that I'm commendable in every way. But that's not what they say. But the point is, I'm not willing to change what I say to get approval. And you have to set your mind beforehand and realize that you don't want disapproval, but say, yes, I don't want disapproval. That is a fact. However, I even less want Jesus' disapproval, and I'm not going to swap the one for the other. I'm going to go for Jesus' approval and put up with their disapproval. You take authority over yourself and you force yourself to do what's right, even if it means standing alone, which it will frequently do. In today's church, the person who does what's right will stand alone, or maybe with a little cluster of people around him. But the crowd will be over there doing what's wrong. So refuse to follow any leader or group that's going in the wrong direction. Be willing to pay the price for that conviction, no matter how unpopular it makes you. And make your mind up now that you're going to do that. Don't wait for the moment. It says in John 12, 42, 43, it says, nevertheless, many, even of the authorities, believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Now, would you want that said about you at the judgment seat? If you do that, that's going to gain you an advantage at the moment, but a massive and eternal disadvantage at the judgment. So, wise people seek God's kingdom first, and they're serious about staying on the narrow path. They know there is a narrow path. They know they're meant to be on it. They know it's narrow. They know about it. Because they're seeking his kingdom first, they're going to make them much more likely to make right decisions and to get their other priorities in the right order. Focusing on his kingdom first also means focusing on the life that is to come. Focusing on the millennium and the eternal kingdom. You've got to focus on that. You've got to think regularly about that. If you think about that, that's seeking his kingdom. Seeking his kingdom first will affect the way you act today. Look at what Jesus said about the narrow gate and the narrow way or path, and about how those who choose the wrong way are subsequently locked out. Now, we've all heard those things, but which of us actually take them seriously? And Jesus didn't use words loosely. He meant what he said, and he said what he meant. And he's essentially saying that we have a choice as to whether to go to destruction or to life as an unbeliever, to go to destruction or to have eternal life, even as a believer. To have rewards or not to have rewards. Now, most people choose not to have life and to go to destruction. Even amongst Christians, many choose, at least by default, by the absence of a decision, not to be rewarded. many, many Christians will not be rewarded. That has to be the case because of the warnings were given. Those warnings would not be given if they weren't needed, if they were irrelevant, if they were unnecessary. So, there are many things that Jesus has said that are shocking, but the modern day Western church has tended to water them down or ignore them. But a wise person pays close attention to Jesus' words or to any word in the Bible. Every word in the Bible is Jesus' word, but we need to pay particular attention to them and take them deadly seriously. And if we don't do so, we're not wise. Whatever it is we're not wise. So a wise person will not brush aside a warning. Warnings are in the Bible for a reason. And they're not, in the main, addressed to other people somewhere else living in another town. They're addressed to us. Or at any rate, they may be. And we need to inquire whether they're addressed to us, at the very least. But most people, in my subjective opinion, even in churches, don't really take seriously what Jesus said or what the Bible said about the warnings, about the narrow gate, the narrow way. It's not really taken seriously, the implications of that. Because what are the implications? If you're going to be on the narrow way, it's going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be hot, it's going to be difficult, there's going to be flack, it's going to be difficult underfoot, there's going to be brambles, there's going to be all sorts of obstacles in the way. Well, what's the broad path like? Easy underfoot, nice, straight, got plenty of people with you, popularity, everything's going easily and nicely, it's just so good. But a wise person will choose the narrow way because he knows it's right and because he knows it's worth it. But also, we mustn't just make the assumption that we're on the narrow way, that wherever we are must be the narrow way. It may not be. You may be on the broad path. If what you're doing isn't bringing you in any way into conflict with the world or its values, if you have popularity and are accepted and no one finds what you believe or say objectionable, then you better check your beliefs because they are meant to be objectionable. So, another point. Wise people realize that they're not the center of the universe. Wise people don't allow themselves to be ruled by self-interest, which most people do. In fact, it's part of the wisdom of this world. Self-interest, look after number one. You are the center. The world revolves around you. That is the astronomy of the world. And the more you put God and other people at the center and yourself at the edge, the wiser and happier you'll be. You can never be happy if you take center place in your own universe. One reason for that is that other people won't cooperate with you because their astronomy puts themselves at the center. So you're going to be colliding with their planets and things because they are at the center of their universe. You won't be able to pull that off because they're not going to cooperate. But secondly, God won't cooperate with that. He has opinions about who's at the center of the universe, and he doesn't think you're at the center of it. So in my law firm, the way the best staff ran their files was to keep the client at the center. That's what I used to preach. The client comes first. The firm comes second. You come last. So that's why I was so popular as a boss. But I used to tell them, and you might think, well, he's not a very nice boss. But actually, if a person would have listened to what I said, they'd have been a success in their career, because that's the way to succeed. You put the client first, you put yourself last. You put your employer ahead of yourself. If that's the pecking order, you'll succeed. If you reverse the pecking order, you'll fail. Most people reverse the pecking order. But those who did as I said, those who made the client first, the firm second, themselves last, all did well. The ones who reversed it, all did badly. Because a self-centered member of staff, a self-centered anything, a self-centered preacher, a self-centered Christian, will never choose any course of action which would involve in additional difficulty or pressure for himself, or which would require them to have to admit an error, or to seek help to put it right, or to be open about things. A person who's putting themselves at the center won't go that way. And the people who are like that all fail. The unselfish ones always succeeded. So not putting yourself first in the thinking of this world is absolute foolishness. It's absolutely idiotic to put yourself anything other than first. But in God's economy, he doesn't agree with that. He thinks that putting yourself last and putting him first and others second and yourself last is the way to promotion in his kingdom. That's what he thinks. Now, a wise person says, if that's what God thinks, I'm going to agree with him. So wisdom comes from finding out what God thinks and agreeing with him. It doesn't come from figuring things out and forming a view. Like Jean-Paul Sartre. What a great intellectual he was. The man was a complete blithering idiot. So he worked out all these things for himself. Albert Camus and all these people. Jacques Prévert, all these so-called intellectuals in France. All blithering idiots. Talking absolute manure. But these are supposedly intellectuals, because French people sort of worship intellectuals. But that's what they call intellectuals. I call intellectuals people like Paul. People like Apollos. Those are intellectuals. Not Albert Camus. So, we put ourselves last, God first, everything works. Your astronomy works. It will work out for you. And if it doesn't work out in this world, which isn't guaranteed, this is a principle. The principle is it will work out well in this world. The guarantee is it will work out well in the next. God doesn't guarantee anything working out well in this world, but he does guarantee that that kind of astronomy will have a good result in the next world. And if a wise person looks at it and thinks, well, I want to do well in the next world, I'm going to do whatever brings me a good result in the next world. That's wise. Another point. Wise people don't assume that they're automatically in the right. Most people do. So a wise person accepts correction and is open to being shown to be in the wrong and is actually positively looking to find out whether he's in the wrong. Now, a wise person, this is the exact opposite of what anybody else will do. The vast majority of people have it as an automatic reflex reaction, just like they're tapping underneath their kneecap. It's automatically obvious that they're both right and in the right, especially the latter part, in the right. A person is always in the right, no matter what. That's the reflex reaction, the default setting. But if you're wise, why on earth would you assume that? Why would you always be right or in the right? A wise person will want to find out whether he's in the right, not immediately assume that he is in the right. And so a wise person will also realize, because of his own sinful nature, his capacity for self-deception. The more easily he can see his own faults and bad habits and his own bad attitudes and his own wrong priorities, the more ready he is to think, hang on, maybe I'm not in the right. So these are the questions that a wise person will ask of themselves about any given controversy or situation. Firstly, am I acting wrongly, or selfishly or unfairly in this situation? Number two, who is really right? Who is really in the right on this issue, me or the other person? Number three, what does God think about this situation? Number four, what does God want me to do? Number five, am I being carnal or am I reacting in a carnal way? Now, how many people ask themselves those questions about a dispute? Most people who are in a dispute or any kind of conflict or problem automatically assume themselves to be right and in the right, and their own priorities and needs to be the most important, their own desires to be the most important, their own objectives are the most important, they themselves are the most important person in the room. Now, I believe that the average person enters a room knowing that he's the most important person in the room. knowing it as a fact. Not just thinking it, he knows it to be a fact. It's something he's never doubted, never questioned, never plans to question. But how likely is it that you could be the most important person in the room? Why on earth would you be? And so the thing is, why would you be automatically in the right in a dispute? A wise person wants to find out whether he's in the right. And he's more concerned about wronging another person than he is about being wronged. If you get wronged, there are no eternal consequences to you for being wronged. Somebody nicks your car, somebody takes your parking plate, somebody whatever. There are no eternal consequences to someone wronging you. But there are eternal consequences to you wronging someone. And if you're wise, you'll be more concerned about wronging someone than about being wronged. Because you won't have to answer for being wronged, but you will have to answer for wronging someone. And that will have eternal consequences. So if we're wise, we'll say, am I wronging anybody? Am I doing wrong? And you're not going to be able to work that out unless you entertain the potential possibility that it could just be possible. Asking yourself the question is a vital starting point to finding out whether it's the case. And once you begin to think of judgment as a real thing, this will be a lot easier. Because if you're thinking about the judgment as a real thing, rest assured, we're going to be at the judgment one day. There's no doubt about it. Every single one of us. Hopefully we'll be at the judgment seat of Christ. Now, that's the one. I'm worried about that one. If we go to that, all these situations and conflicts that we dealt with, we're going to find out who was in the wrong. It's no good going to Jesus and telling him who was in the wrong. He's going to tell us who's in the wrong. He's going to tell us, actually, you were in the wrong. What? Me? In the wrong? Yes, you. In the wrong. Why was I in the wrong? The way you reacted. I didn't like it. Now, wouldn't it be better to ask him now whether he thinks you're in the wrong than to find out then that he thought you were in the wrong? Bring it into the present tense. Don't leave him. Ideally, you want to leave Jesus without an agenda on the judgment day. You want to leave him with nothing to say other than praise. But you want him to say these words. I did have some things to say to criticize you. However, they've all been dealt with. I've got nothing further to add. Wouldn't that be nice to hear him say that? I want him to say that. So ask him now whether there's anything he's not liking. Or am I in the right? Am I doing wrong? Am I treating this person properly? And that's the kind of question he will answer. So a wise person is not merely willing to be corrected now and to have his own wrong ideas, attitudes, behaviour exposed and rebuked. He positively wants to be, because we take it off the agenda on the real day that really matters. And we bring it onto the agenda for today, which isn't a very important day. Don't you see? And Psalm 141 says, let a righteous man strike me. It is a kindness. Let him rebuke me. It's oil for my head. Let my head not refuse it. And Proverbs 17:10, a rebuke goes deeper into a man of understanding than 100 blows into a fool. And so we need to be looking for rebuke, which goes against every bit of your flesh nature, because who on earth wants rebuke? But you do want it if you're thinking of the judgment. So paradoxically, the wiser a person becomes and the more knowledge and understanding they have, the more they will listen to advice. And wise people realize they can't rely safely on their own ability or judgment, and that they need other people and also God. So therefore we need correction. We need to be rebuked. Now ideally you want to get it from gracious people who give it graciously. But if you can't get that, accept it from rude people who give it rudely. And consider this example in the life of King David. It was on a difficult day for him. His son Absalom had just been killed, and David was grieving over Absalom, understandably. And Joab, the commander of the army, came to David and said to him, he said, listen, this is a critical moment for you. These people have just come back from fighting Absalom's rebellion. They put their lives at risk for you, and here you are. You'd be happier now if he was alive and they were dead, and they know it. So don't you go out doing any more of this. Cut the grieving. Thank these people for what they've done. Now that was a blunt way to speak to David. I've paraphrased it a bit. But that's what Joab said effectively to David. And David realized that Joab was right and he was wrong. And what did David do? He accepted the advice. But it was given ungraciously. Joab was really racked off with David. And Joab did not give the advice graciously in the way that the prophet Daniel would have given it. Joab gave it rudely to his superior officer. But he accepted it. And sometimes, it's only the rude people or the ones who hate you, the hostile people, who are willing to tell you the real truth about yourself. Because your own friends will be too kind to do it. And also they don't want to lose your friendship by doing it. But the people who hate you don't have a friendship, but they don't care about losing it because they don't want you to be their friend. So they'll tell you that you're fat and ugly. Well then, you're more likely to hear it from them than from your friends. They'll tell you something that's wrong with you, some inconsistency, some hypocrisy in you, some falseness in you, some selfishness in you, that your friends won't tell you about. So even your enemies have a valuable role to play. There's a redemptive purpose in hearing what your enemies have to say. If you're wise. Of course, you don't have to believe everything they say. You have to critically appraise what they say. But what you shouldn't do is automatically rule it out. So if an enemy says to you that you're selfish and you're this and you're that, we need to critically appraise it. It could be they're just imputing their own motives to you. But it could be they've seen something in you. And we should at least entertain the possibility that it might be that they're telling us something that our friends won't tell us. So, wise people have the love of the truth. What's the love of the truth? It means that they would rather know what's true, even if it puts them in the wrong, or puts them in a disadvantaged situation, or embarrasses them, or shows them to have been wrong. They'd rather know the truth than avoid the truth and avoid all those embarrassments and disadvantages. So the love of the truth means wanting the truth no matter what the consequences are. Even if it means that we lose out, that we're in the wrong, that we have been embarrassed or shown to have been wrong or have done wrong. The love of the truth means wanting to know what really happened, what's really true. What does God really think about this? So a person who has the love of the truth will interrogate or interview himself to find out whether he's in the right, rather than just assume it, as we mentioned. Now, have you ever interrogated yourself? I was a bobby for 3 years, and then I was a solicitor for many years, 25 years. I used to have interrogated no end of people, more people than you've had hot dinners. But one of the people I've learned to interrogate is myself. You have to get yourself in a police cell, and you have to sit yourself down and say, right, sit down there. And then interrogate yourself about your motives, about what you're thinking, about why you did it. Why did you really do it? Yeah, but what was your real motive? What are you really in this for? Why are you doing this? That kind of thing. Now, how many people do that? Or is it just me? Looks like it's just me. So that's what you've got to do. If you do that, you'll be surprised what things you come up with. God can cooperate with that process of you interrogating. If you do it, he doesn't need to send someone else to do it. He doesn't need to send any Edomites over or do anything like that. You can do it for him, and he can do it with you. He would much rather you come clean like that in an interrogation of that kind than have to deal with you. He'd much rather it. So a wise person doesn't assume his own interests and needs automatically come ahead of others, and he's also slow to form a conclusion about himself being in the right. He could eventually form that conclusion, and it's perfectly proper to form that conclusion if you've looked at it open-mindedly rather than with a knee-jerk reaction. Because it may well be you are in the right. Sometimes you will be. Hopefully you will be. But it should be a conclusion you arrive at after a proper examination, not just by reflex. So the love of the truth means you love the truth for its own sake, no matter where it leads you, no matter where it takes you or ends up bringing you, even if you're in the wrong. And I've encountered in my own experience defensive and resentful reactions from some church leaders when I've attempted to raise with them some point in their teaching. I remember once speaking to a particular leader. I gave him the fake name Norman in book 6. He's called Norman. All the people in these books have got false names, but this chap, I've given him the name Norman. And he was giving a sermon one day, and he was actually giving a sermon on the book of Jonah. But I felt he'd misunderstood it. He'd misunderstood Jonah. He'd misunderstood what happened. He'd misunderstood why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. He'd misunderstood a lot of things, in my opinion. I could be completely wrong. Norman might have been absolutely right. But I went up to speak to Norman afterwards, and just went very privately, one-to-one. I was very polite to him, and I just tried to explain that I just had one or two thoughts about what he'd been saying about Jonah. And he had no interest. He didn't want to know. He wasn't bothered what I thought about Jonah. And he didn't want to be corrected. He didn't want anyone to tell him anything. But I thought about it, and I thought, well, a right-thinking person would want to be corrected. If I'd given a sermon, and if someone wants to come and see me today, I'd be happy to. If you think I've said something wrong, I'd really like to hear it. Because it can only benefit me. It could be that you're right and I'm wrong, in which case I'll benefit. Or it could be that I'm right and you're wrong, in which case you could benefit from me saying to you, no, that's not what I meant. What I meant was this. Or, actually, I did mean that, but actually, no, I still hold to it. I think it's true. And you might gain something. So either one of us might gain something. But Norman wasn't bothered. He wasn't interested. And he just wasn't bothered whether he'd got it right about Jonah or not. He couldn't care less. And partly I think it was because he had a clergy mentality. He was clergy, I was a lay person. It wasn't my place to speak to him. I think there was partly an element of that in it. But I think a bigger issue was he didn't have the love of the truth. And I don't base that judgment of Norman solely on this incident. There are other things that have happened that caused me to think that he wasn't very bothered about the love of the truth. But he wasn't really bothered what Jonah said, or whether what he'd said about Jonah was right or wrong. And I also don't think he wanted to have any loss of face by admitting he'd got anything wrong. But I was perfectly willing to have a loss of face by him telling me that I've got it wrong. I've not got a face to lose. I'm not seeking to have a face. And why should I want to have a face? I just want to say what the Bible says. If someone can show me that I've got it wrong, I'd like them to show me. And then I'll say, right, fair enough. I'll stop saying what I've just said and I'll start saying what you've said. All you've got to do is come and tell me and I'll accept your view if it's right. But he didn't want that. I later found out another reason why Norman didn't want to talk about that sermon, and it was because he'd downloaded it from the internet. And he'd done absolutely no work on the sermon whatsoever. He just downloaded another man's sermon. And I don't think Norman had actually done a lick of work on it, because the sermon was accompanied by these most beautiful slide illustrations that I'm quite sure Norman didn't do. And it's just a funny thing that his own sermon should be so perfectly reflected by these beautiful pictures of Jonah and so forth, that he just matched everything he was saying. But he'd got it off the internet, and because he'd got a sermon off the internet, he actually didn't hold any views or have any personal convictions of his own about Jonah at all. So he just wasn't interested. So there's another reason, which is not good. But a wise person wants to know the truth, even if he has to change his mind publicly, so that others can see his error and be made aware that he used to be wrong on a certain point. That is anathema to many people, especially leaders and teachers. That's considered an unendurable loss of face. But why should it be? What's wrong with being wrong? You see, the thing is, who isn't wrong? Who on earth is not wrong about anything at all? So if we're wrong about something, we should want to be told, certainly want to be told, and be perfectly willing to have it publicly pointed out. And the more senior we are as a leader, the more willing we must be to have it pointed out. And one person I admire is a chap called Chuck Missler. Many of you will know him. But he was saying that he redid his teaching series whenever he came to disagree with himself. So he had tapes and things, which he did in 1990, and then in 2000 he'd redo it. And then in 2010 he'd redo it, because he no longer agreed with himself. Now I admire that. Why should you not admire him? Wouldn't he be foolish to say, well, look, if I redo that series, people are going to think that the great Chuck Missler has made a mistake. He says that he even had to do Matthew 3 times because he came to think differently about it. What is that's wrong with that? That's perfectly right. God will promote a man who thinks that way. So a wise person wants to develop the quality of the love of the truth. You want to develop anything that God says is good. If God says eating peaches is good, I'd want to eat peaches, even though I don't really like them. But if he said in the Bible eating 10 peaches is the way to grow as a Christian and become wise, I'd be having 3 tins a day. Because if that's what God says, I want to do it. So if he says the love of the truth is the way forward, I want that. Do you see? Isn't it just so obvious? The things that he says we should have are the things that we should pursue and seek. So why would you want to preserve the appearance of having been right when you now know that you were wrong? Wouldn't it be better to let the truth come out? So, there are many advantages and benefits that come from being corrected, and a wise person will go looking for it. So why don't you pray something like this? You could say, Lord, please point out to me any mistakes in my logic or errors of fact or gaps in my knowledge or anything else which I'm unaware of. Speak to me through the Bible or through other people. Let me know where those errors are. Please also let me see my own sins and character faults as clearly as other people can see them. Now that's a dangerous prayer to make because God will answer it. But it's also a very wise prayer to make because he will answer it. And you'll benefit from him answering it. But the fact is that's not how most of us pray. We would rather maintain our dignity and appear to have been right even when we know full well we were wrong. So, instead of learning the truth, Norman chose the avoidance of exposure, the avoidance of lost face and so forth. That's not right. Norman lost out through that. He could have learned something. And I could have learned something from Norman. But instead of that, he just wasn't interested. So, a person who doesn't love the truth only wants the truth if it doesn't cost him anything, or if it doesn't involve him in any inconvenience. But if you lay down those preconditions to the truth, you won't get the truth. Because the truth will almost always cost you something and almost always lead to inconvenience. Well, pretty much always. And if you persist in maintaining your own opinions rather than accepting what God says on an issue, this is the problem. There will come a point when God will hand you over or give you over. That means he'll just leave you alone to get on with it. And that's a dangerous thing. You never want to be in that place. It says here in Psalm 81, verse 12. Verse 11 and 12. But my people did not listen to my voice. Israel would not submit to me. So I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own counsel. Can you see how scary that is? If you're wrong, you want God to say so, not let you drive over a cliff because you're adamant you're going the right way. Another point. Wise people take care not to be wise in their own eyes, wise in their own eyes. So a wise person, counterintuitively, realizes that such wisdom as he does have is only limited. The wiser you are, the more you realize how limited your wisdom is. Because you realize what's missing from it. And you realize what you don't know. The more you know you don't know things. I can remember when I was at school doing economics O-level. And I really liked economics, my favourite subject. And I thought, when I get to do A-level, I'll really know a lot about it. And then I did A-level economics. And I thought, when I did A-level economics, do you know something? when I get to do degree level economics, I'll really know a lot about it. So I went and did economics as a degree. And do you know what I thought at the end of doing that? There were more questions and more things I wanted to know than I wanted to know when I was doing O-level economics. Because that's the way it is. The further you get in something, the more you know that you don't know things. And also, the more you don't trust yourself or rely on your own knowledge or ability. Anybody who relies on himself, his own ability, his own knowledge, his own judgment, is a fool. Because they're not reliable. And that's what the Bible calls being wise in your own eyes. It's an overconfident belief in your own ability to understand situations and to decide what to do. And the Bible repeatedly tells us not to be that. Proverbs 3 verse 7. Be not wise in your own eyes. Isaiah 5:21. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight. Proverbs 26:12. Do you see a man who is wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. And Proverbs 28:26. He who trusts in his own mind is a fool, but he who walks in wisdom will be delivered. Well, what does that mean? Walking in wisdom means not trusting in your own mind. So evidently, wisdom is not defined as the workings of your own mind and the conclusions it reaches. That's folly. Wisdom is finding out what God thinks and agreeing with him. So find out when does God think the Battle of Hastings was? Find out what he says and agree with him. Do you see? Don't start arguing with him about the merits of 1065. Quite a good year. And just say, no. He says 1066. That's good enough. If God says it was 1066, agree with him. Don't go with your own view. Don't argue with God. And also don't rely on yourself in the sense of believing that you are sufficient and what you think, know and understand is sufficient. It isn't. No matter who you are, you're never going to be sufficient to be able to rely on you. You always need the Holy Spirit. You always need the application of Scripture. You always need to ask God's guidance. Unless it's doing the 5 times table or something. But if you are facing any significant issue, you need that. Okay, that's the end of talk 4.